This past week, I've been rereading Mark Haddon's short story collection, The Pier Falls, the leading story of which starts with some really effective description that just uses brief, vivid, but moving details. If you're looking for a way to improve your description or to beam the vision of your story into your reader's mind, then this technique might be a way to do that. I'm going to show you some description from the story and then talk about what we can learn from it so that we can use it in our own writing. So let's get started. I often find that the very best way to approach description in my writing is to think about Bob Ross. No, really. I'm sure you're familiar with his painting shows already, but if not, there's loads of them on the internet. But the point is, we should handle description the way that Bob handles paint. He doesn't dip his brush in as far as it'll go so that he can smear on as much paint as possible, as thick as possible, so that the brightest colours can stick to the canvas. He takes his time and uses light brush strokes and dots and dabs very intentionally to create the scene. And he considers how each individual brush stroke can contribute to the overall picture. That's what I think we should do when we're telling a story. It's almost the same concept. Take this description of an afternoon by the sea. This is the kind of description that's smearing on paint with no moderation, laying it on thick. See if you think it's effective. The wind blew at 7 miles an hour. The sky was a greyish colour and mostly overcast, but with some clouds. There was a ship out to sea that was lit up by the sun, so you could see the rust on its bow. Not absolutely terrible writing, but it's just stating facts about the scene rather than describing it. Essentially, it's telling, not showing, if we want to use writing terms. And the effect that has on a reader is pretty much nothing at all. That kind of description isn't going to make a reader feel anything. It doesn't remind them of some particular afternoon from their life or prompt some kind of nostalgic feeling. It's just a bunch of details that don't really bring much of an image to mind. That passage is just a poor version I created of the opening of the Pier Falls, which is a fantastic story. So let's have a look at the actual version now by Mark Haddon, who's a real Bob Ross of a writer. I hope you'll see how the description and the details that he uses are dabbed and lightly brushed onto the opening lines, the effect of which is totally different. 23rd of July 1970, the end of the afternoon. A cold breeze off the channel, a mackerel sky overhead, and far out, a column of sunlight falling onto a trawler as if God had picked it out for some kind of blessing. As you might have spotted, this passage describes the same features or objects as the previous one, except this time they feel connected and they work together to form a scene. There's actually less detail to every one of them compared with the previous passage, but in this one they paint a much clearer picture of an afternoon. It's a weird kind of concept in some ways, because you would think that the more detail you could give and the closer in you could get to something, the more real it would seem to a reader. But in practice, I don't think that's how us humans really experience the world. Our memories are blurred around the edges and our eyesight can be unreliable, as can all the other senses. The things that bring us nostalgia or some kind of emotional effect really come from what we feel rather than intricate details. That's what us writers need to get at, I think, the feeling, not the particulars or the exact specifications. I think it's a mistake to focus on individual details in great depth. It takes a lot of time for readers to read, and it takes time and energy for us to write and space in our projects, and I don't think it carries enough feeling along with it to make those things worthwhile. That, I think, even extends to how you describe things happening, not just static objects. The Pier Falls is, as the title would suggest, about a collapsing pier in a seaside town, and the opening is full of description of objects and things, but it also has description through actions as well. Here's a couple of examples. A gull picks up a wafer from a dropped ice cream and lifts into the wind. "No deeper than your waist," shouts her father. "Susan, no deeper than your waist." These are the light touches, the suggestions of colour working together to paint a scene. They aren't hugely rich in detail. They don't list the senses and tick each one off in turn. I especially like that second one about the father calling out. Mark Haddon could have given us a load of subtext and said something like this. A little girl runs towards the sea. Her father's worried because she's not a strong swimmer. "No deeper than your waist," he shouts, but she doesn't seem to hear him. And I could go on. But the thing is, there's nothing that those extra details provide that the shorter version doesn't. In fact, I think there's much to be gained here by saying less, by not saying why the girl doesn't hear him. It makes you imagine that maybe she's already too far away down the beach, or maybe she's made friends and she's just too busy talking to them, or maybe she's just willfully not hearing. The feeling is in the wondering for me, and maybe that's the case for a lot of readers. That's why I especially love this description through moving moments, rather than just describing static, unconnected parts of the environment. This kind of description creates a living space in his story, which for me is far more convincing. He's creating a moving backdrop as opposed to a static one, and I think that really helps the story feel more alive. I recently made a video about how to make your story feel more alive, so I'll link that at the end of this one. In another story from the collection called The Weir, there's another example of this living, moving backdrop. A pied wagtail lands briefly on the path in front of him, then hops back into the air and is carried away. This is so much more interesting to me than just telling us there's birds around, or going into great detail about the exact coloration or size of the bird. It doesn't feel like Mark Haddon invented this bird and wrote it into his story. It feels like he's pointing it out to us because it was already there. That makes me feel like an eyewitness or an observer rather than just a reader. So, with that in mind, I set myself a challenge to try and write something like this. A scene that feels alive through its description. I wanted things to move by themselves, that description through small actions. And I wanted to engage the senses without being too obvious about it. And as always, I wanted to tell a story. The result was a 100-word microfiction story called 50 Feet Further. Hopefully, I've been able to use some of those light brush strokes and some of those techniques I've been talking about that I've learned from the Pier Falls. So here's the story. Let me know what you think of the description. When the bus stops, it's not because of a red light or painted white stripes. There's a silent few moments where nothing happens. A coyote sniffs at something further back down the road, the tail of a scent. Then there's the hiss of air brakes, doors folding open. A different hiss, talking, panic. Feet step down onto the baking road, heat softens the horizon. The coyote stops, nose to the air. A small crowd gathers as the engine idles. Those who are at the back still haven't seen it. What's the hold-up here? 50 feet further lies the body. I tried to describe the scene using those small actions, and I tried to get some of the senses in there too. I covered sight with the way the horizon is blurred, and then sound with some of the hisses and other noises. Something I like to remember when I'm using senses in writing in general is that it's often better not to mention them at all. What I mean is, you don't have to say she saw the horizon was blurred, or they heard the hiss of the engines. Leaving the thing to speak for itself rather than defining it with the exact sense that you're using, I think is a bit smoother, and it's a bit less distracting. There's more story and less language. I also tried to avoid going into great detail about any one thing, while also avoiding the story feeling sparse. Hopefully, thanks to the description, that story feels in some way alive to you as a reader. I definitely think it feels more alive for me having described those moving actions than if I just described everything in a static way. So I'd say if you're looking to put that kind of description into practice yourself, I'd remember these three things. Light brush strokes are easier to write and easier to read. You don't have to go into great detail. I think it's better not to. Try describing through action rather than just describing static things. If this was useful, leave me a thumbs up. Thank you so much for watching as always, and happy writing.